They laughed when Alice Gardner walked into the barn, but why did one cut hidden beneath a leather strap make the giant cowboy stop laughing with him? The wagon trace hit the workbench with a hard slap. Men chuckled behind Alice as she opened the seam with her father's worn awl. Then her fingers froze. Beneath the fresh stitching was a clean knife cut. Matthew Keane leaned closer. Someone at High Basin wanted that leather to fail. But who? Stay with us and tell us what you suspect. The wagon left Alice Gardner beside the High Basin Ranch gate at 20 minutes past 3 on a cold September afternoon. She knew the time because she had checked her father's old pocket watch twice during the final mile. The freight driver set her carpetbag in the dust, lowered a long wooden tool case beside it, and pointed toward the buildings beyond the fence. Barns down there. Keane Place. Thank you. He touched 2 fingers to his hat, climbed back onto the wagon, and rattled away toward Granite Ford. Alice stood alone. The road behind her crossed miles of pale sage before disappearing between low ridges. Ahead, High Basin spread beneath the first dark slopes of the Sawtooth country. Cattle grazed beyond split-rail fences. Cottonwoods followed a narrow creek through the lower pasture. A weathered ranch house stood on a rise, smoke lifting from its chimney into a hard blue sky. But Alice looked longest at the barn. It was enormous. 2 stories of dark timber, broad doors thrown open, hay stacked beneath the loft. Men moved through the yard carrying ropes, buckets, harness, and sacks of grain. Horses stamped inside the corrals. Alice picked up her carpetbag. Then she lifted the tool case. That one mattered more. The leather handle had been replaced 3 times. Her father had built the box when she was 16, fitting little compartments inside for awls, needles, punches, knives, thread, beeswax, rivets, and buckles. Everything else she owned could fit inside the carpetbag. Everything she knew how to do was inside that box. She walked toward the barn. A young man carrying a saddle noticed her first. "Ma'am?" Alice stopped. "I've come to see Mr. Keane." Several men looked over. The young man's eyes dropped to her tool case, then returned to her face. "Matthew Keane?" "Yes." "About what?" Alice tightened her grip on the wooden handle. "The position." That brought silence. Someone near the barn laughed. Not loudly at first. Alice knew that kind of laugh. She had heard it behind shop counters, outside churches, on railway platforms. It usually began with one person and gave everyone else permission. A man in a brown vest stepped from the barn. He was perhaps 38, lean through the waist, with a narrow mustache and the easy posture of someone accustomed to being listened to. "The position," he repeated. "Mr. Keane advertised for a harness repairer." The man's eyebrows rose. A second cowhand grinned. The first man looked toward the road. "You traveling with Gardner?" Alice felt the old pressure settle beneath her ribs. "I am Gardner." Nobody spoke for half a second. Then 3 men laughed at once. Alice did not. The man in the vest looked her over openly, from the plain brown traveling dress stretched across her full figure to the worn boots beneath its hem. "You're A. Gardner?" "Alice Gardner." "Well, I'll be damned." More laughter. Alice kept both hands occupied so nobody would see her fingers tighten. The man nodded toward the barn floor. "Better check those joists, boys. Mr. Keane's new hire might put us through to the foundation." The laughter came harder. Alice looked directly at him. He seemed almost disappointed when she said nothing. Then the doorway behind him darkened. A man stepped out. Alice had thought the stories in Granite Ford were exaggerations. They were not. Matthew Keane had to duck beneath the barn lintel. He straightened outside, and for one strange moment, Alice forgot the men laughing around her. He stood roughly 6'7", perhaps more in his boots, with shoulders that made his faded work shirt seem too small across the back. He wore no gun belt, only a work knife at his hip. Dust marked his trousers to the knee. His dark hair needed cutting. His face was not handsome in an easy way. It was too severe for that. "Edgar." The man in the vest stopped laughing. Matthew's gaze moved to Alice, then her carpetbag, then the tool case. He looked past her toward the empty road. "Where's Gardner?" Alice swallowed. "I'm Alice Gardner." His expression did not change. "The harness man. The advertisement said harness repairer. I received 3 letters from A. Gardner. I wrote 3 letters." Matthew stared at her. Alice could almost see him reviewing them. 10 years experience repairing working harness, saddle stitching, trace replacement, reins, cinches, buckles, wagon leather. She had signed every letter A. Gardner because that was how her father had taught her to mark invoices. Matthew looked toward Edgar. Edgar's mouth twitched. You ordered a harness man, and Boise sent you a woman. I didn't come from Boise City, Alice said. I came from Kansas. Edgar smiled. That makes all the difference. A few men laughed again. Matthew did not. That should have helped. It didn't. He still hadn't told them to stop. He walked closer to Alice, and she had to lift her chin farther than she expected. You've worked a ranch? No. Horses? I fitted harness to them. Cattle? No. Winter this far north? No. Each answer seemed to close another door behind his eyes. Alice's cheeks burned. I never claimed any of those things. No. You claimed you could repair working leather. I can. Matthew glanced toward her hands. They were not delicate hands. There were old needle marks along 2 fingers and a pale scar beside her left thumb. Still, he looked unconvinced. Alice had seen that look before, too. Her father's customers had worn it after his funeral. Mr. Gardner did excellent work. Surely you only kept the accounts. Perhaps your husband will continue the business. She had never had a husband. And 6 months later, she had no business either. Matthew turned toward the barn. We're 3 weeks from moving the upper herd. I've got winter tack needing repair and 2 freight sets that should have been done already. I don't have time to teach somebody. I didn't ask you to. Edgar made a small sound behind her. Matthew stopped. His eyes returned to Alice. For the first time, something besides disappointment appeared there. Bring your box. Alice followed him inside. The barn smelled of hay, horse sweat, dust, and oiled leather. Afternoon sunlight came through narrow gaps in the boards. Saddles rested on racks along one wall. Bridles and harness hung from wooden pegs. Men drifted in behind them. Alice heard their boots. Matthew went to a workbench and picked up a thick leather wagon trace. He dropped it in front of her. The buckle struck the wood. 5 minutes. Alice looked at him. For what? Tell me what's wrong with it. Edgar leaned against a post. This ought to be worth watching. Alice set down her carpetbag. Then she placed the wooden case on the bench. She opened it. The familiar smell of beeswax and leather rose from inside. Her breathing steadied. This she understood. Alice lifted the trace. Heavy harness leather, dark with oil and use. The outside showed cracking near the buckle, but not enough to explain why someone had taken it out of service. She bent it, turned it, ran her thumb beneath the keeper. Matthew stood across from her with his arms folded. Alice ignored him. She ignored Edgar. She ignored everyone. Her father used to say leather talked if a person had patience enough to listen. She flexed the strap again. Something moved beneath the stitching. Alice frowned. Knife. Matthew's brow tightened. What? I need my knife. She took a small blade from the tool case. Edgar straightened. Alice carefully cut several old stitches along a narrow repair near the buckle fold. The thread came free. She lifted a thin piece of leather that had been laid over the original strap. Underneath was a cut, clean, straight, deep enough to weaken the trace but hidden where casual inspection would miss it. The barn went quiet. Alice touched the edge with one fingernail. The leather around it was worn and cracked naturally. The cut was different. Matthew reached across the bench. Let me see. She handed him the trace. His large thumb passed slowly over the damaged place. Could it have split? No. Rot? No. Edgar pushed away from the post. Leather breaks. Doesn't mean anything. Alice looked at him. Leather does break. She took the trace back and held it where the light from the doorway crossed the surface. See these little fibers along the edge? Matthew leaned closer. That is what age looks like. Uneven. Dry. It pulls apart a little at a time. Her finger moved to the concealed damage. This doesn't. Matthew studied it. Alice could feel every man in the barn watching her now. Nobody was laughing. She picked up the loose covering piece. Someone stitched this over the top afterward. Edgar folded his arms. Maybe somebody repaired it. If they repaired it, they forgot the repair. What does that mean? Alice laid the two pieces flat. A repair is supposed to make leather stronger. She looked at Matthew. This only made the damage harder to see. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth. Not yet. But the dismissal was gone. How long before it failed? Alice examined the remaining thickness. Depends on the load. A light wagon might go a while. And a freight wagon? She looked at the cut again. Not long. Matthew's jaw tightened. Outside, a horse struck one hoof against a stallboard. Alice closed her knife. This didn't wear through. She raised her eyes to his. Somebody wanted it to break. Nobody moved. Edgar gave a short laugh, but this time no one joined him. That's a mighty large conclusion from one old strap. Matthew continued looking at the trace, then at Alice. She suddenly remembered where she was. A strange ranch, a day's ride from the nearest place she knew, with $11.40 sewn into the lining of her carpetbag. If Matthew told her to leave, she would have to walk back to Granite Ford or hope someone passed before dark. She closed her tool case. All right, she said quietly. Matthew looked up. All right, what? You've seen my work. Alice slid the knife back into its slot. If it isn't what you wanted, I'll go before I lose the light. She reached for the handle. Gardner. Alice stopped. Matthew turned toward the men gathered behind him. His gaze settled briefly on Edgar before moving across the others. The barn had become so still, Alice could hear a horse chewing hay in the nearest stall. Matthew put the damaged trace on the bench. Then he said only two words. She stays. No one argued with Matthew Keane, not in the barn. Not that afternoon. Edgar Lyle gave Alice one last look. The kind of man gives a thing he has not decided whether to dismiss or distrust, then pushed himself away from the post and walked toward the stalls. The others scattered with him. Boots scraped over packed dirt. A latch clicked. Somewhere near the south wall, a horse blew through its nose. Alice stood beside the workbench with one hand still resting on her father's tool case. Matthew picked up the damaged trace again. You said somebody cut it. Yes. And covered the cut. Yes. He turned the leather over. You know that from one look? No. That made him glance at her. Alice touched the opened seam. I knew something was wrong from the way the strap bent. The rest took looking. Matthew considered that. Then he set the trace down. You'll have 2 weeks. Alice blinked. For what? To show me I didn't make a mistake. There was no smile in it. No kindness either. But it was work. Real work. Alice straightened. What are the wages? That caught him slightly off guard. $22 for the month. Room and meals. If I'm dismissed at 2 weeks, $11. Paid when? End of the trial. Alice nodded. Fair enough. Matthew pointed toward the rear of the barn. Tack room's through there. You'll use the left bench. Don't move anything until you know what it is. I won't. Breakfast before daylight. Supper at 6, unless cattle keep us out. If you need supplies, write them down. Freight comes from Granite Ford every Thursday. Alice looked toward the tack room door. And the room? House. For the first time since arriving, she hesitated. Matthew noticed. The bunkhouse is full of men. You're not sleeping there. I wasn't asking to. I know. He said it simply. Then he lifted her carpetbag before she could reach for it. Alice stared. The bag looked almost foolish in his hand. I can carry that. I know. He looked at the wooden tool case. You take the important one. That silenced her. They crossed the yard together. The ranch house stood about 70 yards from the barn, a broad 2-story building of weathered pine with a stone chimney and a narrow porch facing east. A wash line hung behind it. 2 galvanized buckets rested upside down beside the pump. Someone had stacked split wood beneath the kitchen window, with the ends all turned the same direction. Alice noticed things like that. Order told you about people. Matthew opened the side door and led her through a warm kitchen smelling of coffee grounds, onions, and wood smoke. He pointed down a short hall. Second door. The room was small but clean. Iron bed, washstand, pegs on the wall, one braided rug, a white pitcher with a blue crack running down one side. Alice set her tool case beside the bed. Matthew put the carpetbag near the washstand. There's a bolt on the inside. She looked at the door, then at him. His jaw tightened slightly, as though he understood why she had checked. No one comes in without knocking. Alice nodded once. Thank you. He stood there half a second longer than necessary. Then he left. The next morning began in darkness. Alice woke to a knock on the door and Matthew's voice from the hall. 5:15. She sat up quickly. By the time she reached the kitchen, her hair was pinned, her brown work dress covered by a heavy apron, and her sleeves rolled above the wrists. Matthew was already drinking coffee from a thick white mug. A plate held biscuits, fried potatoes, and bacon. He nodded toward it. Eat. Alice did. They spoke almost nothing. At 5:45, they crossed the frozen yard beneath a sky still crowded with stars. The tack room looked different by lantern light. Smaller, more intimate, and worse. Alice stood in the doorway taking inventory. 2 saddle racks, 4 walls of pegs, harness collars stacked beneath a shelf, bits hanging by size, though not carefully, leather reins looped together, a crate of broken buckles, 3 cinches awaiting repair, 2 sets of wagon harness, several discarded pieces shoved beneath the left bench. Matthew followed her gaze. Problem? Several. He lifted one eyebrow. Alice touched a bridle hanging too close to the stovepipe. Heat dries leather. Then she pointed at a pile of damp reins near the wall. And those shouldn't be stored wet. Matthew looked at them. Anything else? Yes. What? She glanced toward him. You told me not to move anything until I knew what it was. His mouth almost changed. Almost. Good answer. Then he left her there. Alice worked. For the first hour, she touched almost nothing. She examined, counted, separated obvious repair jobs from worn pieces that might still be safe. She made notes in pencil on the back of an old feed receipt Matthew had left on the bench. 1 broken Conway buckle, 2 cracked cheek pieces, 1 dry latigo, 3 traces needing restitching, a breast collar with stretched holes, a pair of reins that should have been discarded months ago. Shortly after sunrise, Isaac Perry appeared in the doorway carrying a tin cup. He was 19, narrow in the shoulders, with hair that refused to lie flat beneath his hat. He looked at Alice's notes. Mr. Keane says you really found that cut. I found a cut. Edgar says you could have made it yourself. Alice kept sorting needles. Did he? Isaac shifted. I don't think you did. That was wise. He smiled despite himself. Then his eyes settled on the damaged trace lying at the far end of the bench. How'd you know? Alice picked up 2 scraps of leather. One was old and cracked. The other she cut fresh from a useless strap. Come here. Isaac did. She bent the first piece. Look at the edge. He squinted. Ragged. Age pulls leather apart unevenly. Then she showed him the fresh cut. This one's smooth. Isaac rubbed his thumb carefully across it. Huh. Don't do that with a sharp one. He pulled his hand back. Alice hid a smile. By mid-morning, Isaac had been sent back to the corrals, and Matthew appeared. He didn't ask how she was doing. He simply placed 3 more pieces on the bench. A saddle cinch, a set of wagon reins, a cracked trace. Alice looked up. Testing me? Working you. Difference? Tests don't need doing. She accepted that. The cinch required replacement stitching. The reins needed oil and a new keeper. The trace was finished. She told him so. Matthew picked it up. Could patch it. You could. Would it hold? For a while. How long? Alice met his eyes. You want a calendar date? No. Then don't use it. He looked at the trace again. What would your father have done? The question landed more softly than Matthew seemed to intend. Alice threaded a needle. He would have charged you for a new one. Smart man. He was. Matthew set the useless trace aside instead of arguing. By the fourth day, the men had stopped laughing when Alice crossed the yard. That did not mean they accepted her. It meant they were watching. Edgar, especially. He had a habit of leaning inside the tackroom doorway near quitting time, making comments that sounded casual. Keane likes things done fast, or winter doesn't wait for pretty stitching. Alice never answered unless the work required it. On Friday afternoon, Edgar picked up a repaired bridle and examined the seam. Tiny stitches. They hold until they don't. Alice took it from him. Then bring it back. His smile flattened. Matthew heard the exchange from the main aisle. He said nothing. But Edgar left. The next week brought colder mornings. Frost silvered the hitching rails. Thin ice appeared in the water trough until the sun climbed over the ridge. High Basin's cattle gathered lower in the valley each evening, dark shapes moving through pale grass. Alice began knowing the barn by sound, which stall door dragged, which horse kicked before feeding, which hinge needed oil, which cowhand hung his reins wrong. She still had not reorganized the tack room, not fully. Instead, she made small changes. Wet leather moved farther from the stove. Bits were wiped before hanging. Damaged tack received a chalk mark. Pieces beyond saving went into a separate crate. Matthew noticed all of it. He never praised her. But one morning she found a fresh stack of clean rags beside her bench. Another morning, a new cake of saddle soap. Nothing was mentioned. On the 9th day, Matthew came in carrying an armful of old equipment. Found these in the wagon shed. He dropped them carefully. Alice looked through the pile. Most was ordinary neglect. Then her hand stopped. A breast strap, dark leather, old repair. She bent it. The movement felt wrong. Not as obvious as the first trace, but familiar. Alice reached for her knife. Matthew saw the change in her face. What? I'm not sure yet. She opened the stitching slowly. Inside, under a narrow strip of leather, was another cut. Smaller, shallower, hidden. Matthew moved closer. You're sure? Alice looked at him. You asked that last time. I know. She turned the strap toward the window. This one could have lasted months. Then why cut it? I don't know. Edgar appeared in the doorway. What now? Matthew did not answer. Alice examined the old stitching around the cut. There was no signature to it. Nothing obvious. But the idea settled uncomfortably in the room. Matthew took the strap. Where'd this come from? Edgar shrugged. Wagon shed, I reckon. Matthew's eyes hardened. Whose? Edgar scratched his jaw. Could have been from the spring set. We had 3 teams running freight. Alice looked at the strap again. Was anyone hurt? Silence. Edgar's expression changed first. Only slightly. Matthew set the leather down. One man. Alice waited. Who? George Talbot. Thrown when a harness failed coming off the south grade in April. Badly? Broke his collarbone. Was laid up 6 weeks. Alice looked from Matthew to the opened leather. Outside the tack room, Isaac stopped sweeping. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Edgar finally shook his head. Old harness fails. Doesn't mean we've got some ghost creeping around with a knife. No, Alice said. He looked at her. It doesn't. She laid the first cut trace beside the newly opened strap. The damage was not identical, but it was close enough that Matthew's gaze stayed on both. Alice touched the second cut. This was hidden too. Edgar scoffed. You finding trouble because you're looking for it? Alice folded the loose leather back. No. Her voice stayed quiet. I'm finding what somebody expected no one to look for. Matthew's eyes lifted toward Edgar, then toward the doorway. Isaac. Yes, sir. Bring me every discarded trace, cinch, breast strap, and set of wagon leather from the storage loft. Isaac stared. All of it? All of it. Edgar gave a tired laugh. You serious? Matthew picked up the first damaged trace and the second strap. Completely. By sundown, the tack room floor was covered in leather. Alice worked beneath 2 lanterns while wind pushed dry leaves across the barnyard outside. Matthew stood at the far end of the bench, sorting pieces into piles without speaking. Most showed nothing unusual. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. Because 3 did. Not full cuts. Not enough to prove anything by themselves. But damage in places a man would not usually see unless he removed stitching or folded leather backward. Matthew stared at the pile. Then he gathered the first damaged trace, the one Alice had opened on her first afternoon. He carried it out. "Where are you taking that?" "My office." Alice watched him cross the aisle. A moment later, she heard the ranch house door open in the distance, then close. He returned 10 minutes later, empty-handed. "You locked it up?" "Yes." "Why?" Matthew looked at the leather spread across her bench. "Because I'm done throwing things away before I know why they broke." He turned to leave. Alice looked down at the next strap in her hands. There was a faint mark beneath the buckle fold. Her thumb stopped. She pulled the leather toward the lantern. The cut was shallow, old, and this time she recognized the stamped number beside it. She had seen that number that morning in Matthew's equipment ledger. Alice looked toward the barn aisle. "Matthew." He stopped. She had never called him by his first name before. He came back. Alice pointed to the number. His face changed. "What?" She slid the ledger across and tapped the matching entry. The strap had belonged to the saddle set used by one of High Basin's best cowhands during the accident the previous spring. Alice raised her eyes. This one was cut too. Matthew came back to the bench without a word. He leaned over the ledger, one large hand braced beside Alice's pencil marks, and read the entry again. April 17th. Bay Gelding. George Talbot. South grade. Saddle set, number 26. Alice placed the damaged strap beside the book. The shallow cut sat beneath the buckle fold where dirt and use would have hidden it. Matthew's thumb moved over the leather once, then stopped. Behind them, Edgar cleared his throat. Could still be where? Alice looked at him. So could the first one. Edgar's face hardened. Matthew shut the ledger. "That's enough for tonight." Nobody argued. The men began carrying the loose harness back to the storage loft, but Matthew told Alice to leave the suspicious pieces where they were. He took the ledger with him and locked it in his office along with the first trace. Alice watched the office door close. The ranch had felt different since she arrived. Now it felt watchful. The next morning, work went on anyway. High Basin did not stop because 3 pieces of leather raised questions. Cattle still needed water. Horses still needed feed. Fence crews still rode out before sunrise. Alice learned that quickly. By 6 o'clock, she was at her bench with a mug of coffee cooling beside her elbow and a pile of reins waiting for new keepers. The tack room door stood open to the barn aisle. Outside, frost covered the rails and turned every hoofprint in the yard white around the edges. Isaac appeared carrying a saddle over one shoulder. "Mr. Keane says this one needs fitting." Alice looked at the saddle. "To what horse?" "Dolly." "Which one is Dolly?" Isaac stared. "You don't know Dolly? I've been here 9 days." "Oh." He shifted the saddle higher. "Gray mare. Small white star. Bites if she thinks you've got oats. That narrows it down." Isaac smiled. He led her to the second corral. Dolly stood near the fence, compact and gray, watching everything with the expression of an old woman disappointed by young people. Alice approached slowly. She did not pretend to know horses better than she did. Instead, she watched. Isaac held the mare while Alice checked the saddle tree against her back. The fit was close, but not right. Alice stepped back. "I need to see it from the other side." She moved around Dolly and frowned. The mare was taller than the horses Alice had worked around in Kansas. Not by much. Enough. She tried to position the saddle and felt the strain immediately. A cowhand sitting on the fence called over. "Need somebody to fetch you a ladder?" A few men laughed. Alice ignored them. She tried once more. The angle was wrong. She lowered the saddle. "I need a mounting block." The cowhand laughed again. "For fitting a saddle? For seeing what I'm doing without pulling my shoulder out?" Edgar was standing near the barn door. He shook his head. "Never saw a saddler need furniture before." Alice looked toward him. "Smart people use leverage. Fools use pride." The yard went quiet. Isaac lowered his eyes to hide a grin. Matthew had just come around the corner carrying a coil of rope. He had heard every word. Alice saw that immediately. His face gave nothing away. He walked past. No rescue, no reprimand, nothing. Alice found an overturned feed crate and used that instead. By noon, Dolly's saddle fit correctly. 2 mornings later, Alice came out of the house before daylight and stopped beside the barn. A new mounting block stood beneath the hitching rail. It was made of heavy pine, wider than the crate, with 3 low steps and cross-braced legs. The corners had been sanded smooth. The top was broad enough to stand on without twisting an ankle. Alice touched one edge. Fresh saw marks showed beneath the cold. Matthew walked out of the barn carrying a lantern. She looked at him. He kept walking. Alice looked at the block again. "You build this?" Matthew stopped. "No." She waited. He turned slightly. "Maybe the barn did." "The barn does good work. It's improving." Then he walked away. Alice smiled after he was gone. It was small, private. She used the block that morning, and every morning after. High Basin began finding its rhythm around her. Alice still occupied the spare room in the ranch house, though at first she treated it like a rented corner. She kept her carpetbag packed. Her spare dress remained folded inside. Her father's tool case went with her to the barn every morning and returned with her every night. Nothing was left behind. Not yet. Breakfast happened before first light. Matthew usually drank coffee standing at the kitchen counter while reading whatever note a hand had left from the previous night. Alice ate at the table. Sometimes they spoke. Mostly they didn't. One morning he slid a folded receipt toward her. "Granite Ford order goes Thursday." Alice opened it. Lamp oil, salt, coffee, horseshoe nails, flour, kerosene wicks. At the bottom was a blank space. "Write what you need." She added linen thread, beeswax, 2 harness buckles, a bottle of neatsfoot oil, and a packet of saddler's needles. Matthew read the list. "Anything else?" "A better awl-haft." He looked toward her tool case near the door. "Yours broken?" "Cracked." "Put it down. I can wrap it." "Put it down." Alice added it. He folded the receipt and slipped it into his coat. No discussion. That Thursday, the freight wagon returned with everything on the list, including 2 awl-hafts. Alice set one aside. She said nothing. By the 3rd week, the tack room had become hers in ways she did not announce. Wet leather no longer hung near heat. Buckles sat sorted by size in shallow wooden trays. Broken equipment carried tags cut from old feed sacks. One pile said, "Repair." One said, "Replace." One said, "Ask before using." Isaac had copied her lettering onto a scrap of board and nailed it above the bench. Alice found him there one afternoon studying one of her stitches. "You pull too hard," she said. He looked guilty. "I wasn't touching anything." "You were thinking about touching it." Isaac grinned. "How can you tell?" "You lean closer when you're about to make trouble." He laughed. Then he pointed toward the stitch. "Why is that one slanted?" Alice set down the bridle she was working on. "Because straight stitches tear straight." She showed him how the thread crossed the strain. Isaac listened carefully. From the barn aisle, Matthew watched for a moment. Alice did not notice until he moved. Their eyes met. He nodded once. That was all. Still, she worked the rest of the afternoon with a strange warmth beneath her ribs. Small things accumulated. A mug of coffee sometimes appeared beside her bench before she reached it. Never sweetened. Matthew had noticed she took it plain. A worn blanket was added to the tackroom chair when the mornings turned colder. The hinge on her bedroom window stopped rattling after a windy night. She never saw him repair it. She knew who had. Alice answered in the only language that seemed safe between them. Matthew's work gloves had split along the palm. He left them beside the wash basin one evening and came down the next morning to find them stitched, reinforced, and rubbed with oil. He picked them up, looked at the repair. Alice stood at the stove cutting bread. "Charge me?" "No." "Why not? You built the mounting block." Matthew pulled one glove on. "It fit." "I told you the barn did that?" Alice kept cutting. "Then tell the barn thank you." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, then disappeared. The ranch hands noticed changes too. Not all liked them, but they began bringing things to her. A broken spur strap, A cracked rein, a saddlebag buckle. Nobody asked whether she knew how anymore. They simply put the damaged thing on the bench and waited. Even Edgar stopped making jokes. That did not mean Alice trusted him. It meant he had become quieter. One afternoon, she caught him watching while she marked a damaged breast collar for replacement. "What?" Edgar shrugged. "Nothing. You've been standing there long enough for something." He looked at the tag. "Keane lets you throw away a lot of leather." "I don't throw away anything safe." "And you decide what's safe? That's what he hired me for." Edgar's eyes narrowed. Then Matthew called from the yard. "Lyle!" Edgar turned and left. Alice watched him go. She thought about the hidden cuts, then forced herself back to work. There was no proof against anyone. Suspicion could ruin a ranch nearly as fast as sabotage. By late October, snow showed on the higher ridges. The nights came earlier. Alice's room changed without her meaning it to. Her second dress left the carpetbag and hung on a peg. Her Bible moved to the washstand. The tin comb sat beside the pitcher. Her father's tool case no longer returned to the house each night. It stayed beneath her bench. The first evening she realized this, she stood in the tack room doorway looking at it. That little wooden box had gone everywhere with her since Kansas. Now she had left it in a barn without thinking. Matthew came through carrying a saddle. "You done? For today." He set the saddle on a rack. Alice glanced toward the tool case again. Matthew followed her eyes. "You want it brought in?" She thought about it, then shook her head. "No." "All right." He turned to go. Alice noticed the saddle behind him. Not the one he had carried. The covered one. It hung alone at the far end of the room beneath a dark canvas cloth. No tag, no chalk mark, no dust disturbed around it, except where someone occasionally swept the floor. She had noticed it before. Now she noticed something else. Every saddle in the room had been moved at least once since she came. That one never had. "Matthew." He stopped. Alice pointed. "What's under there?" His body went still. "Not much. Just enough." Alice knew immediately she had touched something that did not belong to the ordinary business of the ranch. Matthew looked at the covered saddle for a long moment, then at her. "Leave that one alone." His voice was quiet. Alice nodded. "All right." He walked out. She did not ask again, but when the lantern light shifted across the tack room that evening, Alice saw the outline beneath the canvas. A high cantle, a worn horn, a saddle built for a man who had once expected to use it again. And for the first time since coming to High Basin, Alice understood there was something inside Matthew Keane's silence that had nothing to do with her. The first real snow came 3 nights later. It began as rain shortly after noon, thin and cold, tapping against the barn roof while Alice worked a new keeper onto a set of reins. By 3 o'clock, the drops had thickened into wet flakes. By 4, the yard had gone white around the edges. Matthew came through the tack room door carrying 2 lanterns. Road to the bunkhouse is already slick. Alice looked toward the barn entrance. The wind drove snow sideways through the open doors. Everyone made it over? Most did. Most? Isaac is still checking the north stalls. As if summoned, Isaac hurried past a moment later carrying a feed bucket. Matthew called after him. "Finish and get inside." "Yes, sir." Alice tied off her stitch. "I can stop." Matthew shook his head. "Not yet." She glanced at the half-repaired harness in front of her. "Thought you were worried about the road." "I am." "Then? You're not crossing it." Alice looked up. Matthew set one lantern on her bench and the other near the tack room wall. "You stay here until it eases." "With you?" "I've got work." He said it like that settled everything. Maybe it did. By 5:30, the barn had gone quiet except for horses shifting in their stalls and the soft scrape of snow against the doors. Isaac left with the last of the hands. Alice and Matthew remained. The lanterns cast amber circles over the tack room. Shadows hung long from saddle horns and bridles. Stove gave off a dry iron heat, just enough to take the bite from the room. Alice worked with her sleeves rolled. Matthew sat across from her with a broken saddle tree propped between his knees. For nearly 20 minutes, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. That surprised her. Most silence she had known in other places had been punishment. This was different. It made room. Matthew shaved a sliver from the damaged wood and tested the fit. Alice watched his hands. Large hands, scarred knuckles, careful movements. You repair saddles too? Enough to keep from waiting 3 weeks for somebody else. That why you advertised? No. He kept working. I advertised because I'm tired of doing it badly. Alice smiled. Honest answer. Best kind. The wind struck the barn hard enough to make the wallboards tremble. Alice glanced toward the door. Matthew looked up too. Roof holds. I didn't ask. You looked. She returned to her stitching. Maybe I was admiring the weather? You weren't? Another 10 minutes passed. Alice finished the reins and hung them on the correct peg. When she came back, Matthew had stopped working. His eyes were on the tool case beneath her bench. You carried that all the way from Kansas. Yes. Your father made it? Alice rested one hand on the lid. When I was 16. Matthew nodded. Good joinery. He'd be pleased you noticed. You talk about him like he's still in the room. Alice looked toward the lantern. Sometimes it feels that way. Matthew said nothing. The storm pressed closer around the barn. Alice sat down again. My father had a shop in Abilene. Not much to look at. One front room, one workroom, little stove that smoked whenever the wind came from the north. Matthew listened. He taught me harness before he taught me accounts. Said leather was honest if you didn't rush it. Sounds right. He also said customers were not. Matthew's mouth shifted slightly. Alice ran a thumb over a spool of waxed thread. When he was alive, men would come in and praise the stitching on a breast collar or a set of reins. They'd shake his hand and say he had the finest work in town. She paused. He used to tell them I'd done half of it. What happened after he died? Alice looked down. They stopped believing him. Matthew's face hardened. Even though he was dead? Especially then. She gave a small breath that was not quite a laugh. The shop owed money. Rent, leather stock, a doctor's bill from the winter before. I thought if I kept working, I could hold it together. Could you? The work, yes. The men, no. She picked at a tiny nick in the bench. One customer brought a saddle in and asked when the new man would be coming. Another told me his wife did not want him leaving valuable tack with a woman alone. 2 others started taking my patterns to a shop down the street. Matthew stopped moving entirely. Your patterns. The measurements. The cuts. Even the way I reinforced the wagon straps. And the man down the street used them? Yes. Did he pay you? No. Did he ask? No. Matthew set the saddle tree aside. Alice expected sympathy. She had heard enough of that. Poor thing. Hard luck. A shame. Instead, Matthew said, Then he stole from you. Alice looked at him. He held her eyes. No other word for it. Something in her chest shifted. Not relief, exactly. Something simpler. The clean weight of being believed. He called it business. He was wrong. The lantern flame moved between them. Alice lowered her gaze before he could see too much. Outside, a horse snorted softly. Matthew returned to the saddle tree. Alice picked up another strap. For a while, they worked again. Then the wind changed. One loose corner of the canvas at the far end of the tack room lifted and fell. Alice saw the saddle beneath it, the one nobody touched. She hesitated. Matthew noticed. His hands slowed. Alice pointed carefully. That belonged to your brother? The room changed. Not sharply. Just enough. Matthew set down the knife. Yes. Alice waited. He did not seem angry that she had asked. Only tired. What was his name? Philip. How long ago? 14 months. Alice looked at the covered saddle. I'm sorry. Matthew stared at the floor for a moment. Mercer Pass. She had heard the name once from Isaac, a narrow route north of the ranch where the trail climbed between rock and timber. Riding accident? He nodded. Cinch failed. Alice's eyes moved back to the canvas. Matthew noticed that too. He was bringing cattle through the pass. Horse shifted under him on the grade. His voice remained level, too level. The cinch went. Saddle rolled. He came off. Alice did not ask how badly. She did not need to. The rest was already in the room. Matthew stood and crossed to the saddle. For the first time since Alice arrived, he touched the canvas. His fingers rested on it. Then he pulled the cloth back. The saddle underneath was dark brown, worn smooth along the seat, the horn wrapped in old rawhide. One stirrup leather had been shortened more than the other. The skirts showed years of use. Alice did not step closer. Matthew stared at it. He liked this one better than the others. Why? Said it sat right. A small pause. He said that about horses, too. Never cared what they cost. Just whether they sat right under him. Alice smiled faintly. Sounds stubborn. He was. Like you? Matthew looked at her. Worse. That almost became a smile. Almost. Then it disappeared. Alice studied the saddle from where she stood. The cinch itself was gone. Only the rigging remained. Was the cinch recovered? Matthew's shoulders stiffened. Yes. Did anyone examine it? I did. The answer came too quickly. Alice kept still. Matthew's gaze returned to the saddle. I checked it the morning he rode out. The words were quiet now. Not for her. For himself, Alice said nothing. He continued. Leather looked good. Buckle was sound. Stitching held. His jaw tightened. I put my hands on it. The storm seemed farther away. I told him it was fine. Alice looked at Matthew's hands. The same hands that built a mounting block, because she needed one. The same hands that had sorted damaged leather beside her. I see. He laughed once under his breath. There was no humor in it. Do you? Alice met his eyes. No. That surprised him. She went on, I know what you told me. That's not the same as knowing what happened. Matthew turned toward her fully. I inspected it. Yes. And it failed. Yes. So there isn't much mystery. Alice looked at the saddle, then back at him. There's always more than one way something can fail. His face closed. She saw it happen. Alice did not press. Instead, she returned to her bench and picked up her needle. A minute later, Matthew covered the saddle again. Carefully. He carried the repaired saddle tree to the rack. The storm continued another hour. By 7, the snow had softened to a steady fall. Matthew walked Alice back to the house with a lantern, though the path was only 70 yards. Neither spoke. At the porch, Alice brushed snow from her sleeves. Matthew held the door open. She started inside. Alice. She turned. He rarely used her first name. His face was half in shadow. I was the last person to check Philip's saddle before he died. Alice waited. Matthew looked toward the barn, then back at her. I've been certain of that every day since. He stepped away before she could answer. Alice watched his lantern move through the snow toward the barn. Only when the light disappeared behind the doors did she go inside. That night, lying awake in the small room, she thought about Philip's covered saddle, about the 3 hidden cuts already found, and about Matthew Keane saying there was no mystery left. Alice stared at the dark ceiling. She was no longer certain he was right. The snow melted off the lower fields 2 days later, leaving the road to Granite Ford slick with mud and frozen ruts. By the following Monday, Matthew had a list pinned beneath the kitchen clock. Lamp oil, rivets, salt, coffee, 2 sacks of flour, harness buckles, kerosene wicks, leather from Harlan's freight store. Alice stood beside the table reading it while Matthew finished breakfast. You're going today? He folded his napkin once. We're low enough on lamp oil that waiting for Thursday freight would be foolish. Alice looked at the leather entry. I need to choose the hides myself. Matthew lifted his coffee mug. That bad? The last shoulder they sent was too dry. He drank. Then come. Alice looked at him. It was the first time he had asked her to leave High Basin with him. All right. They were on the road by 7. Matthew drove a heavy freight wagon pulled by 2 bay geldings, Duke and Amos. Empty crates were tied down in the bed behind them. Alice sat beside him under a thick wool blanket, her father's tool case wedged safely beneath the seat. The morning air cut through every seam in her coat. Matthew handed her a second pair of gloves without looking over. "I have gloves. Those are dress gloves. They're work gloves. They're thin." Alice examined the heavy pair he had offered. "Do you keep spare gloves for every passenger?" "No." She put them on. They were far too large. Her fingers disappeared inside them. Matthew noticed. "I'll find smaller ones in town. These are fine. You can't bend your hands." "I don't need to. I'm sitting." He glanced at her. "You always argue over things people give you?" "Only things I didn't ask for." "That often?" "More since I came here." Matthew made a quiet sound that might have been amusement. The wagon rolled south through open sage country. Granite Ford sat roughly 18 miles from High Basin, where the freight road crossed a shallow river and split toward Boise City. From a distance, the town looked like little more than smoke and squared rooftops pressed between pale fields. By 10 o'clock, they reached the first buildings. A blacksmith's hammer rang somewhere ahead. Men stood outside the feed store talking beneath a faded canvas awning. 2 freight wagons waited near the hitching rail. A dog slept in the sun beside a water trough. Matthew stopped in front of Garrison's Mercantile. A woman came out before he had fully climbed down. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with silver beginning at her temples and a brown wool dress covered by a white apron. Matthew Keane. Her voice had the familiarity of someone who had known him too long to be impressed by his size. "Mildred." Her eyes moved to Alice. "And you must be Miss Gardner." Alice stepped down carefully. "Alice Gardner." "Mildred Garrison." Mildred shook her hand. No hesitation. No long look at Alice's body. Just a handshake. "I've heard about you." Alice glanced at Matthew. "That worries me." Mildred smiled. "Mostly that you've got Matthew buying decent harness leather for the first time in years." "I've always bought decent leather," Matthew said. Mildred looked at Alice. "You see what I deal with?" Alice smiled before she could stop herself. Matthew walked inside. Mildred lowered her voice. "He likes being right. I've noticed. He doesn't get enough practice." That made Alice laugh. She heard Matthew from inside. "I can hear both of you." Mildred called back. "Good." The store smelled of coffee, flour, wool, and lamp oil. Shelves climbed nearly to the ceiling. Tin cups hung from hooks. Bolts of fabric stood along the rear wall beside work shirts and winter stockings. Alice spent nearly an hour examining leather. She rejected one hide, accepted 2, added rivets and needles to the order. Matthew paid from a ranch account, and Mildred wrote each item in a narrow ledger before handing him a receipt. While he carried flour to the wagon, Mildred wrapped Alice's supplies in brown paper. "You settling in?" Alice looked toward the window. Matthew was lifting a 50-pound sack as if it weighed nothing. "For now. High Basin is a good place." Alice folded the receipt. "People say that." Mildred tied the package with string. "People say plenty." Alice looked at her. Mildred's expression remained calm. "If you're waiting for Granite Ford to decide what sort of woman you are, you'll grow old before breakfast." Alice slipped the package under her arm. "I've already had enough towns make that decision. Then perhaps let this one wear itself out." She handed Alice the parcel. Outside, Matthew was tying down the last crate. He had also bought smaller gloves. Alice saw them on the wagon seat. She said nothing. Neither did he. They ate noon dinner at a small room behind the hotel kitchen where travelers could buy stew and bread for 20 cents. Matthew took the chair nearest the door because the other chair would have left his knees pressed beneath the table. Alice noticed. He noticed her noticing. "What? Nothing. You're smiling. Your knees don't fit. They rarely do." For once, he smiled back. It changed his whole face. Not dramatically, just enough that Alice had to look down at her coffee. They left Granite Ford shortly after 1. The wagon rode lower now with flour, salt, lamp oil, hardware, and 2 rolled hides secured beneath canvas. Clouds gathered over the western ridges. Matthew studied them once. "We'll make the ranch before dark." Alice tucked the new gloves beneath the blanket. "I trust your judgment." He looked at her. That sounded dangerous. It was meant to. The first few miles passed easily. They talked more than usual. Nothing important. Which horse on the ranch stole oats? Why Isaac could remember every horse's markings, but never remember where he left a hammer. Why Matthew drank coffee strong enough to remove paint. Alice learned that Philip had once tried to sweeten Matthew's coffee without telling him, and nearly started a family feud. Matthew learned Alice hated raisins. That's unreasonable. They're disappointed grapes. That doesn't mean anything. It means exactly what I said. The road narrowed as it climbed toward High Basin country. Patches of snow remained beneath the pines. By late afternoon, the wagon began descending a long, frozen grade where the road curved above a shallow ravine. Matthew slowed the team. Easy. The bays shortened their steps. Alice heard the harness creak. Leather always made noise under strain. That was normal. Then came another sound. A thin snap. Not loud. Wrong. Alice sat straighter. Matthew. He kept his eyes on the horses. What? Stop. We're halfway down. Stop. Something in her voice made him pull the reins. Whoa. Duke and Amos resisted the loaded wagon behind them. Matthew worked the brake lever. The wagon slowed. Another sound came from beneath them. A short, tearing pop. Alice's stomach dropped. Now. Matthew hauled the brake harder. The wheels locked against the frozen dirt. The wagon slid several feet before stopping at an angle. Duke tossed his head. Amos stamped. Matthew held the team steady. Alice was already climbing down. Stay clear of the wheels. I know. The road tilted beneath her boots. She moved toward the rear harness. Matthew came around the opposite side. What did you hear? She crouched beside the holdback strap. The leather ran taut from the harness toward the wagon. Alice touched it carefully. The strap looked sound. Then she saw the buckle fold. Take the load off it. Matthew braced the wagon with a stone and adjusted the team until the pressure eased. Alice bent the strap backward. There, a narrow line hidden beneath the fold. Her mouth went dry. Knife. Matthew came closer. You sure? Alice looked at him. He realized what he had asked. Right. She worked the buckle loose. The moment the metal cleared, the strap separated in her hands. Matthew stared at the two pieces. For a long second, neither spoke. Below them, the road curved sharply. Had the strap broken while the wagon was moving, the weight of the loaded bed could have pushed forward against the team. Maybe Matthew could have controlled it. Maybe not. Alice looked at the bays. Duke was still breathing hard. Matthew's face had gone very still. How far? What? How much farther would it have held? Alice examined the cut. Not much. A mile? No. Half? Alice shook her head. Maybe 100 yards. Maybe less. Matthew turned and looked down the grade. 100 yards ahead, the road steepened. He took off his hat and dragged one hand through his hair. Then he put it back on. We repair it here. We replace it. With what? Alice pointed toward the wagon. I made you buy spare leather. Matthew looked at her. You did. I enjoy being right too. Under different circumstances, he might have answered. He did not now. They worked beside the road until the light turned thin. Matthew held the lantern while Alice fitted a replacement strap from the leather roll they had bought that morning. Her hands stayed steady. His did too. But every few moments, she caught him looking toward the cut piece lying on the wagon bed. When the repair was done, Alice tested it twice. Matthew tested it again. They resumed the descent slowly. Nobody joked. By the time High Basin's gate appeared through the dusk, the first stars were out. Matthew drove straight to the barn. Edgar was there with Isaac and two other hands, stacking hay near the aisle. You're late, Edgar said. Matthew climbed down. Unload tomorrow. Edgar looked at the supplies. Something happen? Matthew took the broken holdback strap from beneath the seat. He placed it on Alice's bench. The men gathered. Alice opened the buckle fold beneath the lantern. The cut showed clearly now. Edgar looked at it. So? Matthew's eyes moved over the room. First trace. Talbot's saddle set. Now this. Edgar folded his arms. Old leather. Alice shook her head. This piece was sound. You've said that before. And I was right before. Edgar looked toward Matthew. You going to let one woman turn every broken strap into a conspiracy? Matthew did not answer immediately. He looked at Alice instead, not asking whether she was frightened, not asking whether she was certain. Something had changed on that road. He trusted the work. Who had access to this wagon set? He asked. Edgar frowned. Half the ranch. Names. Edgar's eyes narrowed. Me. Isaac. Turner. Holt. You. Whoever hooked the team yesterday. Matthew looked toward Isaac. The young man swallowed. I checked the buckles, sir. Didn't see anything. I believe you. Isaac's shoulders lowered slightly. Matthew looked back at the strap, then at the rows of tack hanging around them. Alice followed his gaze. Nearly every longtime hand at High Basin used the barn. Nearly everyone could reach the harness, including Edgar. Matthew picked up the cut strap. This isn't bad luck. No one spoke. He looked around the tack room once more. Somebody at High Basin is damaging my equipment. The barn seemed to shrink around them. Alice stood beside him, close enough that the sleeve of his coat nearly touched hers. This time Matthew did not move away. For 3 days after the cut holdback strap came off the freight wagon, Matthew changed the way High Basin worked. Nothing dramatic, no speeches, no accusations. He simply stopped allowing repaired tack to leave the barn without a second set of eyes on it. Alice checked every harness. Matthew checked the wagons. Isaac began writing dates on small feed sack tags tied to repaired pieces so they could track when work had been done and who had handled it last. Edgar disliked the change. He made that clear without saying much. He rolled his eyes when Alice asked him to sign off on a saddle set. He muttered once that High Basin had become a courthouse instead of a ranch. Matthew heard him. Then stop giving us evidence. Edgar went quiet. Winter settled harder over Granite Ford country. By the second week of December, snow lay in the north-facing draws, and the creek wore ice along its edges. The ranch house smelled of coffee, wool drying near the stove, and the pine logs Matthew carried in after supper. One evening, Mildred Garrison arrived from town in a sleigh behind a chestnut mare. Alice met her at the porch. What are you doing out here? Mildred climbed down slowly. Bringing mail. She lifted a small parcel. And preventing you from attending Saturday's social dressed like you intend to mend harness during it. Alice stared at her. I'm not attending. Mildred walked past her into the house. We'll discuss your mistake inside. Matthew was at the kitchen table with a ledger open. Mildred set the parcel down. Tell her. Matthew looked from Mildred to Alice. Tell her what? That she's going Saturday. Alice folded her arms. I am standing here. I know. Mildred untied the parcel. Inside was dark blue wool. Not fancy. Good cloth. Alice touched it once. You bought this? You paid me for those repairs last month. I repaired 2 harness straps, and I overpaid you. You did not. I'm older than you. Let me lie. Matthew looked back at his ledger. Alice saw the corner of his mouth move. You too? He did not look up. I'm reading. Mildred turned toward him. Are you going? Matthew sighed. Yes. Alice looked at him. You attend socials? Against my better judgment. Mildred smiled. Then it's settled. It was not settled. Not until Friday evening, when Alice stood in Mildred's back room in Granite Ford, while pins held the dark blue dress close beneath her arms. The dress did not try to make Alice look smaller. That was the first thing she noticed. Mildred had shaped it to fit her shoulders and waist, allowed room through the hips, and kept the skirt full enough to move comfortably. Alice looked at herself in the narrow mirror. For years, dresses had been chosen according to one rule. Hide. Hide the width. Hide the softness. Hide the fact that she took up more room than other women. This dress did not hide anything. It simply fit. Mildred stood behind her with a pin between her lips. You're frowning. I'm thinking. Dangerous habit. Alice touched the sleeve. It's good work. Of course it is. I mean it. So do I. Alice looked at herself again. Saturday evening, the livery barn and Granite Ford had been swept clean and hung with lanterns. Benches lined the walls. A fiddler and a man with a guitar played from a raised platform built from feed crates. Coffee steamed in enamel pots near the entrance. Women set pies and biscuits on long tables covered with white cloths. Alice arrived with Mildred. Matthew had come earlier to help move benches. She saw him before he saw her. There was no mistaking him in a room. He stood near the far wall, taller than everyone around him, speaking with Sheriff Dennis Fowler and two cattlemen. Then his eyes lifted, found Alice, and stayed. Not rudely, not greedily. He simply stopped listening to whatever Sheriff Fowler had been saying. Alice felt her hands go still at her sides. Mildred murmured, "Well." Alice glanced at her. "What?" "Nothing." Matthew crossed the room. He wore a black coat and clean white shirt, no tie, boots polished enough to suggest effort without success. His gaze moved over the dress once, then returned to her face. "You made it." Alice looked around the crowded barn. "Against my better judgment. That makes two of us." For a little while, it was easy. Easier than she expected. Matthew introduced her to people who had only heard of her. A widowed rancher asked if she repaired harness for outside customers. A woman from the hotel wanted a trunk strap fixed. Isaac arrived with two other young hands and nearly spilled coffee when Alice told him his collar was crooked. Then Calvin Driscoll walked in. Alice knew him only by name. He was 50, thick through the middle, with silver at his temples and expensive gloves tucked into his belt. His ranch lay east of High Basin, closer to the freight road. He shook Matthew's hand. "Keane. Driscoll." Calvin looked toward Alice. His smile changed. "So this is her." Matthew's shoulders went still. "Alice Gardner." Calvin offered his hand. Alice took it. "Miss Gardner, I've heard you're saving High Basin one strap at a time. Only the ones worth saving." Calvin laughed. "Sharp, too." He looked at Matthew. "Your large little barn miracle has some spirit." Alice felt the words before the laughter came. Two men nearby heard. One repeated it. "Large little miracle." Another said, "High Basin better order heavier chairs." The laughter spread unevenly. Not everyone joined. Enough did. Alice looked toward the floorboards. For one terrible second, she was back at the High Basin barn door on her first afternoon, tool case in hand, men measuring her before they knew her. Only now she had made the mistake of wearing a dress she liked, of letting herself feel visible. Calvin lifted both hands as though innocence belonged to him. "Come on, Keane. We're only having fun." Matthew looked at him, then at the men laughing. Alice knew what people expected next. Matthew Keane was 6'7" and built like a barn beam. One step forward would have been enough to turn the room cold. He did not take it. Instead, he crossed the space between himself and Alice. He stopped beside her. Not in front. Beside. The laughter faded. Matthew looked at Calvin. "If any man here wants to discuss Miss Gardner's body, he can do it while looking at me." Nobody answered. Matthew's voice remained quiet. "Then he can explain why a man's body is his own business, but a woman's somehow belongs to the whole room." Silence. One of the fiddlers lowered his bow. Calvin's smile thinned. "You're making a serious thing out of a joke." Matthew nodded once. "Yes." That ended it. Not because everyone suddenly became ashamed. Because nobody wanted to be the next man Matthew asked to explain himself. Alice stood very still. Matthew turned toward her. His face changed when he did. The anger was still there, but it was no longer pointed outward. He seemed almost uncertain. That frightened Alice more than his size ever had. He held out his hand. "Would you dance with me?" Alice stared at it. The giant cowboy who could silence half a barn with one sentence was waiting for her answer, like it mattered. She placed her hand in his. "Yes." The fiddler started again. Slow tune. Nothing fancy. Matthew led her toward the open floor. Alice whispered, "Do you know how to dance?" "No." She looked up. You asked anyway?" "Yes." "That seems poorly planned." It was. Her mouth twitched. He put one hand carefully at her back. Not possessive. Not hesitant either. Alice rested her hand against his shoulder. The first step was awkward. The second was worse. Matthew nearly stepped on the hem of her dress and stopped so abruptly she bumped into him. Alice looked up. His expression was grim. "You're laughing." "I'm trying not to." "That's worse. It absolutely is." She laughed then. A real laugh, not small. Matthew stared at her. "What?" "Nothing." "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Saying nothing when you mean something." His hand shifted slightly at her back. They began moving again. Slower this time. He adjusted his stride. That was what Alice noticed most. He could have forced her to match him. Instead, he shortened each step until the rhythm belonged to both of them. Around the room, conversation resumed. People watched. Alice knew they did. For once, she did not care. Matthew's hand was warm through the fabric of her dress. His thumb moved once against the edge of her glove, and then stopped, as if he had noticed himself doing it. Alice lowered her eyes. The music ended. Neither moved immediately. Then Matthew stepped back. "Thank you." "For surviving?" "For saying yes." She looked at him. The words stayed between them. Calvin Driscoll was across the room speaking to Edgar. Alice saw it only because Edgar had arrived late and stood near the rear doors. Calvin leaned close. Edgar listened. Then both men looked toward Matthew and toward her. The moment lasted no more than a second. Edgar turned away first. Alice felt something cold slide beneath the warmth of the dance. "You all right?" Matthew asked. She looked back at him. Yes. It was not exactly a lie. The ride home happened beneath a clear sky. Matthew drove. Alice sat beside him wrapped in the same wool blanket they had used on the freight trip. Neither mentioned Calvin. Neither mentioned the jokes. Neither mentioned the dance. The runners hissed softly over packed snow. At High Basin, Matthew climbed down first and offered his hand. Alice took it. Her boots touched the ground. He did not release her immediately. Neither did she. Then the barn door shifted in the wind. Matthew let go. "Good night, Alice, good night." She walked to the house. At the porch, she turned once. Matthew was still beside the sleigh, watching her. The next morning, coffee waited beside Alice's workbench. Her repaired gloves lay folded nearby. Matthew came into the tack room carrying a saddle, as though the night before had never happened. Morning. Morning. He set the saddle down. Alice picked up her awl. Neither mentioned the dance. That silence was somehow harder than the laughter had been. The days after the winter social settled into a strange kind of normal. Coffee still appeared beside Alice's bench before sunrise. Matthew's gloves still came back to him repaired whenever a seam opened. He still stopped in the tack room with reasons that sounded practical. A question about a buckle. A saddle tree he wanted checked. A receipt he could have left on the kitchen table. But every small thing carried something else now. A pause that had not been there before. A glance held half a second too long. A hand pulled back from the same piece of leather before their fingers touched. Neither of them named it. That was the problem. By the third week of December, the mornings were white and hard with frost. High Basin's creek had narrowed beneath ice. The cattle stayed lower in the valley, their breath rising in pale clouds while the hands fed hay from sleds before daylight. Alice worked with the tack room stove burning low. Isaac sat on an overturned crate beside her, learning to set a copper rivet without splitting the leather. "Not so hard," Alice said. He raised the hammer again. "You said that last time, and you hit it too hard last time. I thought ranch work was supposed to make a man strong." "It is." She took the hammer from him. "Leather work is supposed to make him patient." Isaac grinned. "Mr. Keane could use lessons." Matthew's voice came from the doorway. "Perry." Isaac nearly dropped the rivet. Alice looked down to hide her smile. "Yes, sir?" "North fence now? Preferably before spring." Isaac hurried out. Matthew stepped inside carrying 2 mugs. He put one beside Alice. "Plain coffee. No sugar." She looked at it. "You know, if you keep doing that, people may think you're considerate." "I'll risk it." He reached for a bridle hanging above the bench. Their hands almost met. Both stopped. Matthew moved first. Sorry. Alice's fingers curled against the wood. You didn't touch me. No. That was all either of them said. He took the bridle and left. Alice stared at the doorway after he was gone. The barn felt too quiet. A week later, she rode into Granite Ford with Mildred. Matthew had sent a list for winter medicine, lamp oil, and 2 new halter ropes. Alice needed needles and linen thread. The road had been packed smooth by freight sleds, though the deeper snow remained untouched beyond the ditches. Mildred drove. Alice sat beside her with a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. You've been quiet. Alice looked toward the white fields. So have you. I am driving. I am sitting. Mildred nodded. Fair. They reached town shortly before noon. Granite Ford looked smaller in winter. Smoke stood above the chimneys. Snow was pushed against boardwalk posts. Men stamped ice from their boots before entering the mercantile. Alice finished her purchases first. Mildred was measuring flour for a customer when Alice stepped outside with a parcel under her arm. Calvin Driscoll stood beside the hitching rail. He tipped his hat. Miss Gardner. Alice stopped. Mr. Driscoll. No dancing today? Not in the street. He smiled. Shame. She started past him. Got a minute? I have less if you're planning another joke. His smile thinned. Fair enough. He removed his gloves slowly. I came to apologize. Alice waited. Calvin glanced toward the store window. I shouldn't have said what I did at the social. No. I'd had whiskey. That doesn't improve it. No. He seemed to accept that. Then he leaned one shoulder against the hitching rail. I also came to offer you work. Alice looked at him. Work. My spread. She said nothing. I've got nearly double High Basin's cattle in a tack room that's been neglected for years. Then you need a harness repairer. I do. What are you paying? $40 a month. Alice's expression changed, despite herself. That was nearly twice Matthew's wage. Calvin noticed. Room included. Meals, too. You'd have your own workspace. Alice adjusted the parcel beneath her arm. Why? Because you're good. That's not enough. His eyebrows lifted. You think I need another reason? I think men who laughed at me don't usually double my wages a week later. Calvin smiled without warmth. You're careful. I've had practice. He looked down the street. Keane's got you repairing more than leather, doesn't he? Alice's shoulders tightened. What does that mean? Nothing improper? He raised a hand. I mean High Basin. Alice said nothing. Calvin continued. Matthew's been running that place like a man trying to hold a roof up with his shoulders since Philip died. Alice's gaze sharpened. That's not your business. No. But I knew Philip. That stopped her. Calvin looked toward the mountains. Good man. Reckless sometimes. Alice thought of the covered saddle, the lantern light. Matthew saying, I put my hands on it. Calvin put his gloves back on. Matthew never got over it. I know, do you? She looked at him. Calvin's voice softened. He keeps Philip's saddle, Philip's coats, old tools he doesn't use. Alice frowned. How do you know that? I've known the Keanes 20 years. He looked directly at her. Matthew keeps broken things. The words landed wrong. Alice's hand tightened around the parcel. Calvin continued before she could stop him. Things he thinks he failed. Alice took a step back. He didn't fail me. I didn't say he did. No. You meant me. Calvin shrugged slightly. I meant you should ask yourself a question before you make High Basin your whole life. Alice's face went cold. What question? He held her eyes. Are you the first woman he's chosen? A pause. Or are you just another thing he can't stand to throw away? The street noise seemed to move farther off. A wagon wheel creaked somewhere beyond the hotel. Alice looked at Calvin for a long moment. Then she walked past him. He did not follow. Mildred was waiting inside. She took one look at Alice and stopped tying the flour sack. What happened? Nothing. Mildred did not believe her. Alice set the parcel on the counter. Do you know Calvin Driscoll well? Well enough not to owe him money. He offered me work. Mildred's hands went still. How much? 40. That much? Yes. Mildred looked toward the door. And what did he want besides work? Alice stared at the wood grain of the counter. I don't know. That was the truth. But Calvin's words rode back to High Basin with her anyway. They stayed through supper, through the evening, through the next morning when Matthew left coffee beside her bench without asking. Alice looked at the mug, then at him. Why do you do that? Matthew stopped. Do what? Bring coffee. His brow furrowed. Because you drink it. That isn't what I asked. He stood very still. Alice immediately wished she had chosen another moment. Matthew glanced toward the barn aisle. Did something happen in town? No. Then what is this? I don't know. His face tightened. That's not like you. Alice looked down. No. He waited. She almost told him about Calvin. Instead, she said, Never mind. Matthew did not push. That should have felt respectful. Instead, it felt like distance. He walked away. 3 days later, a letter came from Boise City. Mildred had forwarded it with the regular post. Alice recognized the return name. Harris and Cole Harness Works. She opened it at her bench after lunch. The letter was short. Mr. Cole had seen examples of her work months earlier through a freight dealer in Kansas. A journeyman had left for Oregon. They had an open bench, $35 a month, regular hours, paid work, her own station, no trial. If she wished to accept, she was to arrive by the second week of January. Alice read it twice. Isaac came in carrying a cracked stirrup leather. You all right? Alice folded the letter. Yes. You look strange. I've been told that before. He frowned. I didn't mean I know. She smiled faintly. Put it on the bench. That evening she carried the letter back to her room. Her carpetbag sat beneath the bed. Mostly empty now. The second dress hung on a peg. Her Bible rested beside the washstand. Her father's tool case remained in the barn. Alice sat on the edge of the bed with the letter in her lap. Months ago, she would have accepted before the ink dried. Own bench, good wages, a city, no Edgar, no Calvin, no questions about sabotage, no giant cowboy who could make a room feel smaller simply by standing in it. Alice folded the letter again. The next morning, Matthew was at the kitchen table before dawn. He pushed the coffee pot toward her. Road's bad today. Stay close to the barn. Alice sat down. Matthew. He looked up. She had planned a careful question. Instead, the honest one came out. Why did you keep me? His hand stopped around the mug. Alice forced herself to continue. Not the first day. I know why you did then. He watched her. I mean now. Matthew's face became guarded. You do good work. Alice looked away. There it was. Useful hands. Nothing else. She stared at the steam rising from her cup. Is that all? Matthew did not answer. The clock ticked on the wall. Alice looked back at him. Did you keep me because you wanted me here? His jaw tightened. Or because you couldn't stand sending someone else away? Matthew went completely still. The silence that followed was worse than any answer Alice had feared. The kitchen clock ticked once, then again. Matthew lowered his coffee mug to the table. I don't know how to answer that. Alice looked at him. It was not cruelty. That would have been easier. Cruelty gave a person something solid to push against. This was only Matthew sitting beneath the weak yellow light before sunrise, shoulders broad enough to fill the chair, unable to say the one thing she had finally asked him to say. Alice folded her hands in her lap. You could start with the truth. I am. That's the trouble. His jaw tightened. Alice. No. She stood. The chair scraped softly over the floorboards. I have spent most of my life being useful to people. Matthew's eyes followed her. My father needed my hands. Customers needed my stitching. The men who bought the shop needed my patterns. High Basin needs somebody who knows leather. She stopped near the stove. That is not the same thing as being wanted. Matthew pushed back from the table. I never said you weren't. You haven't said anything. The words came sharper than she intended. Neither took them back. Outside, somewhere beyond the kitchen wall, a gate chain rattled in the wind. Alice touched the folded Boise City letter inside her apron pocket. I got an offer. Matthew's face changed. What offer? Harris and Cole Harness Works. Boise City. He stood. When? Yesterday. How much? $35 a month. His mouth flattened. A real bench? Yes. Regular work? Yes. Matthew looked toward the dark window. Alice almost hated him for asking practical questions first. Then she realized that was who he was. Practical things were safer. They want me by the second week of January, she said. He turned back. You taking it? Alice waited. Some foolish part of her hoped he would answer the question for her. Tell her no. Tell her she belonged here. Tell her anything. Matthew did none of those things. If that's what you want. Alice's throat tightened. She nodded once. Then I'll go on the next supply coach. Something moved across his face. Too fast to name. He looked down at the table. All right. That was all. Alice walked out before she could regret giving him one more chance. The cold struck hard in the yard. Snow squeaked beneath her boots. She crossed to the barn and worked until her fingers hurt. Not because the work required it. Because stopping would mean thinking. Isaac arrived near 8 carrying a torn halter. He took one look at her face and set the halter down quietly. You want coffee? No. That startled him more than anger would have. He nodded and left. Alice repaired the halter, then a bridle, then 3 traces that did not need doing until next week. Matthew did not enter the tack room all morning. At noon, Alice looked toward the covered saddle. Philip's saddle. The thought had been building since the storm. The first cut trace. Talbot's damaged tack. The wagon holdback. Different pieces. Different dates. All hidden. And 14 months earlier, a cinch Matthew himself had checked had failed beneath his brother. Alice stared at the canvas. She had promised not to touch it. She would keep that promise. But she did not have to stay silent. Matthew came in shortly after 2, carrying a coil of rope. Alice set down her awl. I need to ask you something. His eyes shifted toward her. You already did. This is different. He waited. Alice looked toward the covered saddle. I want to examine Philip's. The change in Matthew was immediate. No. Matthew, no. She stood. I haven't touched it. Keep it that way. I intend to. His voice hardened. Then there's nothing to discuss. Alice felt heat rise into her face. There is if his cinch failed for the same reason those other pieces did. Matthew set the rope down too hard. You don't know that. No. Then don't make Philip part of this because you want a pattern. I don't want a pattern. You keep looking for one. Because somebody nearly sent us down a frozen grade under a loaded wagon. He looked away. Alice stepped around the bench. You said you inspected Philip's cinch. I did. You said it looked sound. It was. And then it failed. His eyes came back to hers. Do not. Alice stopped. His voice had dropped. Not loud. Worse. Do not turn the last morning I saw my brother alive into one of your leather puzzles. The words hit. Alice stood very still. Matthew seemed to hear them only after they were already in the room. His shoulders shifted. Alice, no. This time it was her turn. She took one step back. I asked permission, I know. I did not touch it. I know. Because it belongs to your grief before it belongs to my suspicion. Matthew's face changed. Alice picked up her awl. But don't mistake my respect for that boundary as agreement with you. He said nothing. She looked at the covered saddle again. You trust me with every living man on this ranch. Her voice was quieter now. with the harness they ride in, the traces behind their wagons, the straps holding loads down grades. She met his eyes. But the one death you still blame yourself for is the one thing you refuse to let me look at. Matthew's hands curled at his sides. That saddle stays where it is. Alice nodded. Then it stays. He waited as though expecting more. There was no more. Alice sat back down. Matthew stood in the doorway several seconds. Then he left. The silence afterward was not empty. It had weight. That evening, Alice began packing. The carpetbag had been beneath her bed for months. Dust lined one edge. She wiped it clean with a damp cloth and opened it on the mattress. One spare dress, stockings, her Bible, tin comb, needle packet. The dark blue dress from the social took longer. She folded it carefully, then unfolded it, then folded it again. Her hand stopped over the sleeve where Matthew's fingers had rested while they danced. Alice closed her eyes. Only for a moment. Then she put the dress in the bag. Her father's tool case was still in the tack room. She would collect it in the morning. A knock sounded after supper. Alice looked toward the door. Come in. Matthew opened it but did not cross the threshold. He had removed his coat. Snow melted dark at the shoulders of his shirt. His eyes went first to the carpetbag. You're packed. Almost. He looked at the room. The bare peg, the cleared washstand, the Bible already gone from beside the pitcher. You leave Thursday? If the coach comes through. Road may close. Then Friday. Matthew's jaw worked once. Alice waited. He said, Boise is good work, so I'm told. They'll pay you more. Yes. You'll have customers. Yes. He looked down the hallway. Alice could see every word he did not say crowding behind his face. She hated that she still wanted one of them. Finally, Matthew nodded. Good night. Alice stared at him. Good night. He closed the door. Not hard. That made it worse. Hours later, Alice woke to wind-scraping snow against the window. She did not know the time. The house was dark. She lay still beneath the blankets and listened. Then she heard the side door open. Boots crossed the kitchen. A second door closed. Matthew. She knew his steps by now. Alice turned onto her side. Sleep did not return. In the barn, Matthew stood alone before Philip's saddle. One lantern burned near the tack room door. The rest of the building lay dark. He pulled the canvas back. The saddle looked exactly as it had 14 months ago. That was the lie he had maintained. Nothing stayed exactly the same. Leather dried. Dust settled. Men changed. Grief changed too, though sometimes so slowly a person mistook it for permanence. Matthew touched the horn. He remembered Philip laughing that morning. Remembered checking the cinch. Remembered saying, "You're good." 2 words. 2 words that had lived in Matthew's head ever since. He took the saddle down. For the first time in 14 months. It was heavier than he remembered. Or maybe he was. Before dawn, Alice sat awake on the edge of her bed, already dressed. The carpetbag rested near her feet. A knock came. Not the usual one. Slow. She opened the door. Matthew stood in the hall holding Philip's saddle. His face looked older in the gray morning light. He did not ask to come in. Alice stepped back. Matthew crossed the room and set the saddle carefully beside her packed bag. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he looked at the canvas-covered leather as if it belonged to someone else. "If there's something in it I've been afraid to see," he said. "I want you to see it." Alice looked at him. Matthew's hands were empty now. For the first time since she had known him, he looked like a man who had put down something he could no longer carry alone. Alice did not touch the saddle immediately. She closed the door first. Then she moved the carpetbag away from the bed and cleared the small table beneath the window. Matthew watched without speaking. The gray morning was just beginning to reach through the glass. Outside, somebody crossed the frozen yard carrying a lantern. A horse knocked once against a stall wall. Alice lifted Philip's saddle carefully. It was heavy, used. Nothing decorative about it. The seat had been worn smooth by years in the saddle. The horn wrap had darkened where hands had gripped it. One stirrup leather carried a narrow scar from some old repair. Alice set it on the table. "Do you still have the cinch?" Matthew nodded. In the barn. Bring it. He left. While he was gone, Alice studied the rigging without disturbing anything. A person could ruin evidence by being impatient. She had learned that with leather long before she had learned the word evidence. Matthew returned with a wrapped bundle. He laid it beside the saddle. Alice opened the cloth. The cinch was old, but not rotten. The center strap showed wear. The buckle had dulled with age. Matthew stood behind her. This is what failed. Alice looked at him. You're certain? I found it loose after they brought Philip back. His voice changed around his brother's name. Alice nodded. Then we start there. She carried the saddle and cinch to the tack room. Matthew followed. By the time they arrived, the ranch was waking. Isaac was filling a grain measure. Edgar stood near the barn doors, tightening his coat. His eyes went straight to the saddle in Matthew's hands. Alice saw the reaction. Small. Quick. But there. Edgar's mouth tightened, then relaxed. You finally taking that thing down? Matthew looked at him. Yes. For what? Alice answered. I'm examining it. Edgar stared at her. Matthew stepped between the question and anything else. Get the south crew moving. Edgar held his gaze a moment too long, then nodded. All right. He walked out. Alice looked after him. Matthew noticed. What? Nothing yet. They carried Philip's saddle into the tack room. Alice cleared the bench. Isaac hovered at the doorway. Can I watch? Matthew looked at Alice. She nodded. If you don't touch anything unless I ask. Isaac came in quietly. Alice removed the cinch first, then the latigo, then the near-side rigging. She worked slowly. Each buckle went on a clean cloth. Each piece stayed in order. Matthew stood with both hands braced on the opposite edge of the bench. Alice could feel his eyes on every motion, not because he doubted her, because every piece belonged to the last morning of Philip's life. She loosened a worn screw, lifted a leather skirt, stopped. Something beneath it did not match. The rest of the saddle showed honest age, scuffs, darkening. Stretch. One repair, however, had been hidden under the skirt where a rider would never see it without dismantling the rigging. Alice leaned closer. Lantern. Isaac handed it to her. She held it low, there. A cut. Narrow, clean. Not recent. But clean enough in its path that age had not erased what made it unnatural. Matthew's breathing changed. You found something. Alice did not answer yet. She lifted the leather carefully. Beneath the cut was stitching. Ugly stitching. Crossed twice in the same place. Too tight on one side, too loose on the other. Fast work. Concealment, not repair. Alice's stomach went cold. Matthew saw her face. What? She looked at him. I've seen this. Where? She moved to the shelf, pulled down the first cut trace from the evidence pile, then the damaged wagon holdback. She laid both beside Philip's saddle. The same crossed stitch appeared beneath the hidden sections. Not identical in length, identical in habit. Isaac leaned forward. That's the same. Alice nodded. Matthew's hands curled against the bench. You're sure? Alice looked at the 3 repairs. Yes. This time he did not ask again. The room seemed to narrow around him. He stared at the cut beneath Philip's rigging. For 14 months? He stopped. Alice waited. Matthew looked at the cinch. I thought I missed it. Alice said nothing. He pressed one hand against the edge of the bench. I thought I had inspected bad leather and told him it was good. Alice's voice stayed low. You inspected what somebody wanted you to see. Matthew shut his eyes. Only for a second. When he opened them, the grief was still there. But something else had joined it. Anger. Clean. Cold. Isaac looked between them. Who stitches like that? Alice turned toward him. What do you mean? Isaac pointed. That crossed part. Yes. I've seen Edgar do it. Matthew's head lifted. Isaac immediately looked frightened. I'm not saying. Keep talking, Matthew said. Isaac swallowed. On drives. If something breaks and we need it fast, Edgar does a double cross like that. Says pretty stitching wastes daylight. Alice looked down at the repair. Where did he learn it? Isaac shrugged. Don't know. Anyone else use it? Not that I've seen. Matthew's face had gone still again. Alice asked, How often has he repaired tack here? Isaac let out a nervous breath. Years. How many? Longer than me. Since before Philip died. Matthew looked toward the barn door. Edgar had ridden beside Philip, worked beside him, attended his burial, stayed on at High Basin. And for more than a year, Matthew had trusted him with the same equipment that had begun failing one piece at a time. Alice touched the stitch with the tip of one finger. Matthew. He looked at her. This points to Edgar. His jaw tightened. It does. It isn't enough by itself. I know. That answer mattered. A different man might have gone for a rifle. Matthew reached for nothing. Instead, he picked up the damaged trace and turned it over carefully. When did Edgar have access to the wagon holdback? Alice thought back. Everyone did. And Talbot's set? Same. Matthew looked at Isaac. Philip's saddle? Isaac's face went pale. He helped with tack that morning. The silence after that felt heavier than the saddle itself. Matthew straightened. Where's he now, South Crew? Isaac looked toward the door, where he was. Matthew walked into the barn aisle. Alice followed. The hook beside the entrance was empty. Edgar's heavy winter coat was gone. His bedroll strap was gone too. Matthew looked toward the yard. A horse was missing from the rail. Isaac came up behind them. He didn't say he was leaving. Matthew's face changed. Which horse? Red Roan. Matthew crossed the yard in long strides. Alice followed as far as the barn door. Fresh hoofprints cut through the snow. They led toward the lower creek road. Not south. Not toward the work crew. Toward Granite Ford. Matthew stared after them. Alice came to stand beside him. You think he knows? He saw the saddle. That doesn't mean he knows what we found. Matthew looked back toward the barn. No. Then his eyes returned to the tracks. But men don't take bedrolls to check cattle. Isaac shifted behind them. What do we do? Matthew answered without hesitation. Nothing foolish. Alice looked at him. He continued. We keep the saddle. We keep every cut piece locked. Then to Isaac. You stay close to the ranch. Isaac nodded. Matthew turned back toward Alice. You were right. She did not answer. He stepped closer. About Philip. The words cost him something. Alice saw that. I was afraid to look. She held his gaze. You looked now. Matthew glanced toward the saddle inside. Then at the road where Edgar had disappeared. For 14 months, he had lived beneath the belief that one careless inspection had killed his brother. Now the truth was worse in one way, and kinder in another. Philip's saddle had not failed by chance. Someone had weakened it. Someone Matthew trusted had known. And that man was riding away from High Basin before breakfast. Matthew did not saddle a horse. That surprised Alice more than anything. For one hard second, she thought he would follow Edgar down the creek road and drag the truth out of him before noon. Instead, he turned to Isaac. Take the gray mare. Isaac blinked. Sir? Ride to Granite Ford. Find Sheriff Fowler. Tell him I need him here quietly. Isaac looked toward the hoofprints disappearing beyond the lower fence. What do I tell him happened? Matthew glanced at Alice. She answered. Tell him we found evidence that several pieces of ranch equipment were deliberately damaged. Tell him one of those pieces belonged to Philip. Isaac's face tightened. Matthew added, and tell him Edgar left before breakfast with his bedroll. Isaac nodded. Anything else? No. Don't stop anywhere. The young man ran for the corral. Matthew watched until Isaac rode through the gate and disappeared between the cottonwoods. Only then did he turn toward Alice. You still leaving Thursday? The question came so quietly, She almost thought she had imagined it. Her packed carpetbag was still in the spare room. The Boise letter was folded beneath her Bible. Yes. Matthew looked toward the barn. All right. Again. That same word. Alice hated how much it hurt. But this was not the morning to force another answer from him. They had a saboteur to prove. Inside the tack room, Alice began laying out every suspicious piece on the long bench. The first trace. George Talbot's strap. The freight wagon holdback. Philip's saddle. Matthew brought the ranch ledger and an older cattle book from his office. They worked side by side. Dates, equipment numbers, routes, accidents. At first, the entries seemed scattered. A broken trace in May, a snapped strap in July, a failed cinch 14 months earlier. Then Alice noticed something. She moved the ledger closer. Matthew. He leaned over. She pointed at the routes. Look where they were going. He read. South Grade. Mercer Pass. Upper Freight Road. North Herd Transfer. Alice tapped each one. Every failure happened when cattle or supplies were moving toward the pass. Matthew's expression changed. Mercer Pass was more than a trail. It was the shortest reliable route from High Basin's grazing country to the Spring Freight Road. What about the East Pasture? He asked. Alice checked. No failures listed there. Lower Creek? None. He looked at the old book again. Alice turned several pages. There were repeated notes about delayed cattle movement, extra hired wagons, replacement tack, lost time, small costs. Not enough alone to break a ranch. Together, over a year, they became something else. Pressure. Matthew's finger stopped on an entry. Driscoll asked to buy passage through Mercer Pass last winter. Alice looked up. When? After Philip died. Her stomach tightened. What did you say? No. Why did he want it? His eastern route adds nearly 2 days to the rail pens. Matthew stared at the ledger. He offered money twice. Alice thought of Calvin at the hitching rail. $40 a month? Matthew keeps broken things. Her skin went cold. Matthew. He looked at her. Calvin spoke to Edgar at the social. Matthew went still. I saw them. When? After we danced. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't know it meant anything. He exhaled through his nose. Not anger at her. At himself. Alice touched the ledger. It still may not. No. But neither of them believed that. By afternoon, Sheriff Dennis Fowler arrived with Isaac. He came alone, wearing a heavy brown coat with frost caught along the shoulders. Matthew met him outside. Alice remained in the tack room until they entered. Fowler removed his hat. Miss Gardner. Sheriff. Matthew closed the door. For the next hour, Alice explained the cuts. She did not dramatize. She did not guess. She showed. Blade marks, hidden stitching, the repeated crossed repair. Philip's saddle. Fowler listened with both hands resting on the back of a chair. When she finished, he examined the pieces himself. You saying Lyle did this? Alice shook her head. I'm saying this stitch matches the one Isaac has seen him use. Fowler looked at Isaac. The young man swallowed. Yes, sir, Matthew said. Edgar rode out with his bedroll after seeing Philip's saddle come down. Fowler rubbed his jaw. That gives me reason to talk to him, not hang him. I didn't ask you to hang anybody. Fowler looked at Matthew. I know. The sheriff glanced toward the window. Where would Lyle go? Matthew answered. Granite Ford, if he wants supplies. Driscoll's spread, if he wants protection. Fowler put his hat back on. I'll check the creek road. Matthew caught his arm before he left. Quietly. Fowler nodded. Quietly. Night fell early. By supper, Edgar had not returned. No message came from Granite Ford. Matthew ate almost nothing. Alice noticed. She did not mention it. Afterward, she went to the tack room and packed the suspicious leather into a wooden evidence chest. Philip's saddle stayed out. Matthew had said it should. He stood in the doorway watching her close the lid. You should sleep. So should you. I won't. Neither will I. For the first time that day, his expression softened. Only slightly, Alice. Yes? He looked at her as though there were something he meant to say. Then a horse shifted in the main aisle. The moment passed. Lock this room, I will. Alice went to the house shortly before 10. The wind had dropped. Snow clouds covered the stars. She lay awake listening to the old timbers settle around her. Sometime before dawn, she smelled smoke. At first, she thought it came from the kitchen stove. Then it thickened. Sharp. Wrong. Alice sat up. A glow moved against her window. She ran into the hall. Matthew! His door opened at once. He was already pulling on his boots. Barn. They reached the porch together. Flames were climbing the rear wall of the tack room. Not the whole barn. Not yet. But enough. Horses screamed and kicked inside their stalls. Men came running from the bunkhouse half-dressed, dragging coats over shirts. Matthew's voice cut through the yard. Get the horses out! Everything moved at once. Stall doors opened. Lead ropes snapped tight. Hooves struck frozen ground. Smoke rolled under the barn roof. Alice ran toward the tack room door. Matthew caught her arm. No. The evidence chest. No. Philip's saddle is in there too. I said no. Alice looked at him. The fire was still mostly along the rear wall. Smoke thick, but not yet filling the floor. I can reach it. Matthew's grip tightened. Alice. She met his eyes. If that chest burns, Edgar walks. For 1 second, neither moved. Then Matthew took off his wet neckcloth and pressed it into her hand. Stay low. She nodded. He released her. Alice covered her mouth and went in. Smoke stung her eyes immediately. The tack room looked unfamiliar in firelight. Orange along one wall, black above. Her bench was still visible. She dropped to her knees and crawled. The evidence chest was beneath it. She reached the handle, pulled. It caught. Alice braced one boot against the bench leg and dragged again. The box came free. A burning strip of canvas fell near the far wall. She flinched, then kept moving. At the doorway, Matthew appeared through the smoke. He took the chest from her with one hand and hauled her outside with the other. Alice coughed hard in the snow. Matthew set the box down. His hands went to her shoulders. You burned? No. You sure? Yes. He looked at her face, hair, sleeves. Only when he believed her did he let go. Behind them, the hands formed a bucket line from the pump. The fire had spread into the wall, but not yet the loft. Matthew turned back. Philip's saddle. Alice looked toward the doorway. Then Isaac came running from the side yard carrying it. Got it! The leather was blackened along one skirt, but intact. Alice nearly laughed from relief. They worked until the sky began to pale. By sunrise, the fire was out. One rear section of the tack room was charred open to the winter air. Several saddles were ruined. Part of Alice's bench had burned. But the evidence chest sat untouched in the snow. Philip's saddle rested beside it. Sheriff Fowler returned just after 6. He was not alone. Edgar rode ahead of him with his wrists tied loosely in front. His face was gray with cold. Matthew stepped toward them. Fowler dismounted, caught him on the creek road. Edgar said nothing. Fowler reached inside his coat and took out 2 things. A folded packet of cash. A note. Found these on him. Matthew opened the note. Alice watched his eyes move across the writing. What does it say? He handed it to her. The message was brief. No names beyond initials. But the meaning was clear. The next failure had been supposed to happen before spring movement through Mercer Pass, and the payment came from Calvin Driscoll. Alice looked at Edgar. You set the fire. Edgar's jaw tightened. Fowler answered for him. Smoke on his coat. Kerosene smell, too. Edgar finally looked at Matthew. I didn't mean for Philip to die. Nobody moved. Matthew's face went empty. Edgar swallowed. It was never supposed to be that. Matthew walked to the evidence chest. He lifted Philip's blackened saddle, carried it across the yard, set it at Edgar's feet. No gun. No threat. Just the saddle. Edgar stared down at it. His mouth opened. Closed. Then he looked away. Driscoll paid me to make things fail. Alice heard Isaac stop behind her. Edgar continued. Small things. Delays, repairs, spooked teams, lost days. Why? Matthew asked. So you'd lose money. The words came faster now. So you'd get tired of paying men and replacing gear. So you'd sell him passage through Mercer Pass, cheap. Matthew looked at Philip's saddle. And my brother? Edgar's voice broke. That wasn't supposed to happen. Silence. I cut the rigging. Thought it would go bad slow. Thought they'd find it before drive. Matthew's eyes lifted, but he wrote it. Edgar nodded. I should have told you. Yes. I was scared. Yes. I covered it after. Matthew closed his eyes. Only briefly. When he opened them, his voice was quiet. Calvin told you to kill him? No. Edgar shook his head hard. No. Never. He wanted trouble. Money trouble. Nothing more. That was the ugliest truth of all. Philip had not died because anyone specifically wanted him dead. He had died because two men had decided that other people's safety was worth risking for land and money. Matthew stepped back. Sheriff Fowler took Edgar toward his horse. The sun rose over the white fields. Smoke still lifted from the damaged barn. Alice stood beside the evidence chest with soot on her sleeves. Matthew looked at her, then toward the ranch house, toward the room where her carpetbag still waited. The sabotage was exposed. Philip's death had an answer, but none of it had answered the question between them. Alice was still leaving. By noon, High Basin smelled of wet ash, burned leather, and snow. The tackroom wall stood open in one corner where the fire had eaten through the boards. Men carried ruined saddles into the yard and laid them in a dark row beside the fence. Isaac swept water and soot from the floor with a stiff broom, while Alice sorted what could still be savannah. Matthew worked without speaking. He replaced a split door brace, moved feet away from the damaged wall, checked the horses twice. Every few minutes his eyes found Alice. Every time she was still there. That seemed to be enough for the moment. Sheriff Fowler returned from Granite Ford the following day with 2 deputies and paperwork for Calvin Driscoll. Calvin had denied everything at first. Then Fowler produced the note from Edgar's coat. The cash had been wrapped in a bank receipt bearing Driscoll's account mark. There would be a territorial hearing, maybe more. Matthew listened without satisfaction. Alice understood why. No ruling could give Philip back the morning before Mercer Pass. No arrest could erase 14 months of believing he had caused his brother's death. Still, the truth changed the way he carried himself. The old saddle no longer hung beneath canvas. Alice cleaned the smoke from it and placed it openly on her bench. Matthew did not ask her to cover it again. 2 days later, several ranchers came to High Basin to hear Fowler's account. Some had laughed at Alice the first day she arrived. Others had laughed at the livery. Now they stood in the damaged barn with hats in their hands, while the sheriff explained the cut traces, the hidden repairs, the failed wagon strap, and Philip's saddle. Fowler tapped one blackened piece of leather with his finger. Miss Gardner noticed what the rest of you had been calling where. Nobody answered. Matthew stood beside the open barn door. The winter light made him look even larger. Fowler turned toward him. Keane, anything you want added? Matthew looked at Alice. She was holding a saddle skirt beneath the window, scraping soot from the edge with a dull knife. Then he looked back at the men. One thing. The room went quiet. I didn't find this. His voice carried easily. She did. Alice stopped working. Matthew continued. She found the first cut before she'd been on this ranch 10 minutes. She found the second. She heard the wagon strap failing before I did. She saw the stitch on Philip's saddle. One of the ranchers shifted his weight. Matthew's eyes went across all of them. High Basin is standing because Alice Gardner knew her work and refused to let the rest of us call bad luck what it wasn't. Alice lowered her gaze. The words were everything she once would have wanted. Recognition. Respect. Her name attached to the work. And still something inside her remained unsettled, because Matthew had answered the question of what her hands meant to High Basin, not what she meant to him. That afternoon, Mildred arrived with a basket of bread and 2 jars of preserves. She found Alice behind the ranch house, beating soot from a blanket. "You look tired." "I am." Mildred set down the basket. "Heard Fowler arrested Driscoll." "Yes." "And heard you saved half the proof from the fire." "Not half." Mildred gave her a look. Alice stopped beating the blanket. "The Boise coach is supposed to run Friday." Mildred was quiet. "You're still going?" "Yes." "Even now?" Alice looked toward the barn. Matthew stood in the open doorway talking to Isaac. "I came here for work. You found it." "I know." "And?" Alice folded the blanket slowly. "He respects me." Mildred waited. "He trusts me." Still, Mildred waited. Alice swallowed. "But I don't know if he wants me." Mildred looked toward Matthew. "Have you asked?" "Yes." "And?" He went silent. "That man has made a religion of silence." Alice almost smiled. "That doesn't make it easier to live with." "No." Mildred picked up the basket. "What would make you stay?" Alice looked down at her soot-stained hands. "The truth." Mildred nodded once. "Then don't settle for less." She carried the basket toward the kitchen. Alice stood alone in the cold. The next morning she began repairing Philip's saddle. Not because it needed to be ridden again, because she wanted it finished before she left. She replaced the damaged rigging, cleaned the buckle, restitched the leather where Edgar had concealed the cut. Her workbench had been moved beneath the undamaged part of the wall. One edge was scorched black from the fire. She left it that way. Matthew entered near dusk. Alice heard his boots and knew them before he reached the doorway. He stopped beside the bench. "You don't have to finish that." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I want to." He looked at the saddle. Alice pulled the thread tight. "Coach leaves tomorrow." "I know." She tied off the stitch. "Isaac can finish the other repairs. He'll complain. He always does. He learned that from Edgar." Alice's hands paused. Matthew's face tightened. "Sorry." "It's all right." "No." He looked toward the burned wall. "No, it isn't." Alice set down the needle. Matthew took off his hat. That frightened her more than if he had kept it on. He rarely removed it in the barn unless he was staying. "I've been trying to figure out what to say." Alice waited. Matthew rubbed one thumb along the brim. "After Philip died, I checked that saddle every night for almost a month." Alice said nothing. "I kept thinking I'd find the thing I missed." His voice was rougher now. Then I stopped looking because not finding it was worse. He stared at the floor. "I decided the safest way to live was to need less." Alice's throat tightened. Matthew continued. "Fewer people. Fewer promises. Fewer things somebody could take." He looked at her. "Then you came through my barn door." Alice almost laughed, but the sound never came. "You were not what I ordered. I remember. You argued with me. You deserved it. You corrected me in front of my own hands. You deserved that too." This time the corner of his mouth moved. Then it disappeared. I kept finding reasons to go into the tack room. Alice's fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. Buckles, some. Receipts, some. Coffee. That one was deliberate. The silence changed. Matthew took one step closer. "When you said you were leaving, I told myself Boise was better for you." Alice looked at him. "That you'd have your own bench. More money. A town full of customers. And I hated every part of it." Her breath caught. Matthew's hand tightened around his hat. "I thought if I never depended on anyone again, nothing could fail beneath me." His eyes moved toward Philip's saddle. "I treated love like bad harness." Alice went still. Matthew looked back at her. Something to inspect, something to mistrust, something that could kill a man if he put too much weight on it. He exhaled slowly. That was cowardly. Alice said quietly, "Matthew, no. Let me finish." She did. He stepped closer until only the bench stood between them. "I respect your work." Alice looked away. "I know. That isn't why I'm here." Her eyes returned to his. "I trust your judgment." "I know. That isn't why either." Matthew set his hat on the bench. For once, both his hands were empty. "I want you here when this place is strong." Alice did not move. "When it's failing." His voice lowered. "When there's nothing worth saving in it except the people." Alice's eyes burned. Matthew swallowed. "And when I've got nothing worth offering but myself." The barn was utterly still. Alice looked at the man across from her. At the giant everyone else saw first, then at the man beneath it, the one who built mounting blocks and pretended barns did carpentry, the one who left coffee without asking for thanks, the one who had carried his brother's saddle into her room because he finally understood he could not carry the grief alone. Alice asked the question quietly. "If I stay, what am I?" Matthew did not hesitate this time. "The woman beside me." Her breath trembled. "Not your employee? If you want wages, I'll pay them. That isn't what I mean, I know." He came around the bench. Alice did not step back. Matthew stopped close enough that she could see the faint line of soot still caught beside his collar. "The woman beside me when this place is strong," he said again. "When it's failing. When I'm wrong. When you're angry." Alice's mouth trembled. "That will happen often. I'm prepared." "You should be." His eyes softened. Alice looked toward the workbench. The scorched edge, the awls, the neatly sorted buckles, her father's tool case beneath it. Then she looked back at Matthew. "One question. Ask." Alice rested her hand on the scarred wood. "If I stay, does this remain mine?" Matthew looked at the bench, at the burn mark along one edge, at the awls arranged beside the stitching horse, at the shallow trays of buckles Alice had sorted by size, at the old wooden tool case her father had built when she was 16. Then he looked back at her. "It was never mine to give away." Alice did not move. Matthew went on. "You worked for every inch of that bench before I had sense enough to understand what I was looking at." His voice remained steady. "If you stay, your work stays yours." Alice's fingers relaxed against the wood. "Your wages, too? If you want wages." "My opinions?" He almost smiled. "I doubt I could stop those." "You've tried. Unsuccessfully." She looked down. The next question was harder. "And my name?" Matthew frowned slightly. "What about it?" Alice lifted her eyes. "I don't want to disappear into yours." Something quiet passed across his face. "Not offense. Understanding." "You won't." She watched him carefully. Matthew stepped closer. "If you married me tomorrow, you'd still be Alice Gardner when you wake up." A small smile touched her mouth. "That's not exactly how names work." "You know what I mean." "I do." He looked at the bench again. "Keep Gardner wherever you please." She swallowed. Matthew reached into his coat. Alice's breath caught when he brought out a small ring. Plain gold. No stone. Nothing fancy. It looked like something meant to survive work. He held it in his palm. "I bought this in Granite Ford after the winter social." Alice stared at him. "You did?" "Yes." "Before I said I was leaving?" "Yes." "Then why didn't you give it to me?" Matthew's expression went dry. "Because apparently I enjoy making simple things difficult." A laugh escaped her. It came mixed with tears. Matthew's face softened. He closed his hand around the ring. "Alice Gardner." She looked up. "I'm asking badly. You're doing better than usual." "That isn't saying much." "No." He stepped close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him. "I don't want you because you saved High Basin." Alice went still. "I don't want you because you can repair harness better than any man I've ever paid." His voice lowered. I don't even want you because you were the first person in 14 months to make me look at Philip's saddle. Alice's eyes burned. Matthew opened his hand again. I want you because mornings are different when you're in the kitchen. Her breath trembled. Because I know which mug is yours. He looked toward the tack room door. Because I hear you arguing with Isaac from halfway across the barn and know exactly what you're about to say. Alice laughed through the tears now. Matthew continued. Because when you leave a room, I notice. That silenced her. He held her gaze. And because I am tired of pretending that noticing isn't love. The barn seemed to fall away around them. The burned wall, the winter wind, the smell of leather and smoke. All of it faded beneath one simple thing. Matthew waited. He did not take her hand. He did not put the ring on her finger. He simply waited. Alice looked at the giant cowboy standing before her. The man who had once looked at her and seen a mistake. The man who later built a mounting block and pretended the barn had done it. The man who had learned, slowly and painfully, to say what silence could no longer carry. If I say yes, Alice whispered, you understand I'm still keeping the bench. Yes. And my tools. Yes. And if Isaac ruins another edge beveler, he pays for it. From somewhere in the main aisle came Isaac's voice. I heard that. Alice and Matthew both turned. Isaac stood halfway inside the barn with a feed bucket in one hand. His face went red. Sorry. Matthew looked at him. Out. Isaac disappeared so fast, the bucket nearly struck the doorframe. Alice covered her mouth. Matthew waited until the sound of his boots had faded. Anything else? Alice lowered her hand. Yes. What? If you plan to kiss me after this, you are meeting me halfway. Matthew blinked. She pointed upward. I am not climbing you. For 1 second, he simply stared. Then he laughed. Not the small, almost smile she had seen over coffee. A real laugh. Low and warm and completely unguarded. It filled the tack room where men had once laughed at Alice for an entirely different reason. Alice felt something inside her loosen. Matthew held out the ring. Will you marry me? She looked at it. Then at him, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. Of course it did. You measured? Matthew's mouth twitched. Mildred helped. I should have known. She threatened me twice. That sounds like her. Matthew lifted one hand toward Alice's face, then stopped. The hesitation mattered. May I? Alice nodded. Yes. He bent. Halfway. Exactly as promised. Alice rose slightly on her toes and met him there. The kiss was gentle. No rush. No grand gesture. Just warmth and the quiet pressure of his hand against her cheek. When they parted, Alice stayed close. Matthew rested his forehead against hers. You're still taking the Boise coach? No. Good. But I'm writing them. Of course. I won't vanish without an answer. I wouldn't expect you to. She looked toward the workbench. Neither of them noticed Isaac peeking around the barn door until Matthew said, without turning, Perry. The head vanished. Alice laughed again. Spring came slowly to High Basin. March broke the worst of the snow. By April, water ran hard beneath the creek ice and cattle began moving toward the lower grass. The damaged tack room wall had been rebuilt. Alice insisted the scorched edge of her old bench remain untouched. Matthew argued once. She won. Isaac began spending 2 hours each afternoon learning leatherwork properly. He still pulled thread too hard. Alice still corrected him. One morning, a wagon arrived from Granite Ford carrying a narrow wooden board wrapped in burlap. Matthew carried it into the tack room. What is that? Something Mildred ordered. Alice narrowed her eyes. That usually means trouble. Matthew unwrapped it. A painted sign appeared. Alice Gardner, Keane. Harness and tack. Alice stared at it. Gardner remained there. Plain. Visible. Not hidden beneath Matthew's name. Not erased by marriage. Matthew leaned the sign against the bench. Too much? Alice touched the painted letters. No. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church at Granite Ford. Mildred stood with Alice. Isaac wore a coat too large for him. Sheriff Fowler attended because Matthew had once helped repair his winter corral, and because, as he said, he wanted to witness something at High Basin that did not require paperwork. Alice wore the dark blue dress from the livery social. No one altered it to hide her body. It fit exactly as before. Matthew stood at the front of the church looking uncomfortable in a black coat. When Alice reached him, he whispered, "You look beautiful." She whispered back, "You look terrified." "I am." Good. They married anyway. By the end of April, High Basin was moving cattle toward spring pasture. One afternoon, Alice stood behind her bench working on a broken bridle. A man entered the tack room. She recognized him, one of the cowhands who had laughed the first day she arrived. He held the bridle in both hands. "Mrs. Keane." Alice looked up. He shifted. "Miss Gardner Keane." She waited. He removed his hat. "Could you take a look at this?" Alice took the bridle, examined the cheekpiece. "Leather's still good." The man exhaled. "Can it be repaired?" "Yes." "How long?" "Tomorrow afternoon. I'll come back then." He placed the agreed coins on the bench. No joke. No sideways look. No question about whether she knew what she was doing. He simply waited for her judgment. Then he thanked her and left. Matthew passed through the aisle carrying a saddle tree. He did not stop, did not defend her, did not need to. As he passed, his fingers brushed lightly across Alice's shoulder. She looked up. He looked back. That was enough. Outside the open barn doors, snow still clung to the distant sawtooth ridges. The lower fields had begun turning green. Cattle moved slowly beneath the pale spring sun. Alice stood broad and steady behind the same bench where men had once measured her worth with laughter. She had not become smaller. She had not changed herself into someone the valley found easier to accept. The valley had simply lost the power to decide what she was worth. Matthew had not given her a place in his world, and Alice had not been rescued into his. They had built one beside each other. Imagine standing where Alice once stood, carrying the tools you know how to use while a room full of people decides what you are worth before you have even spoken. Imagine finally finding a place that feels like home, only to wonder whether you were loved for who you are or merely needed for what you can do. Alice could have accepted either one. She had spent enough years accepting less. But she didn't, and Matthew had his own choice to make. He could keep hiding behind grief, believing that loving someone meant giving fate another chance to hurt him. Or he could risk building a life with a woman who never asked him to save her, only to stand beside her. Maybe that is what love looks like after life has bruised two people. Not rescue, not perfection. Just two people choosing honesty when silence would be easier, and choosing each other without asking either one to become smaller. If you had been Alice, would you have stayed at High Basin or taken that coach to Boise City? Tell me in the comments. I'd truly like to know. And if stories about second chances, quiet courage, and unexpected love have a place in your evenings, you're welcome to subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting down these old Western roads, some mysterious, some heartbreaking, and some that may leave a little hope behind long after the story ends.